Kneel if you want to stay. Daniel said it in front of everyone at the table like it was nothing. He said it like he was asking for something ordinary, not asking me to give up what little dignity I had left. He was standing across the dining table, one hand resting on the back of a chair, his voice calm, steady. And he was talking to me. No one laughed. Monica froze beside him, her hand still wrapped around her glass. Olivia lowered her eyes so quickly it felt practiced. The room went completely still, like something fragile had just cracked, and no one wanted to be the one to acknowledge it. No one told him to stop. No one said he'd gone too far. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there and looked at him. That's when I understood something with a clarity that felt almost cold. This wasn't a mistake. And in that moment, I knew something had already changed long before that night. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to look anything like the life I had been quietly holding together all these years. My name is Marianne Caldwell. I'm 76 years old, and until that night I believed I understood my place in my own home. I had lived in that house in Naperville for over 30 years. My late husband and I bought it when the neighborhood was still new, when the trees were thin and the sidewalks looked too clean to belong to real life. We raised Daniel there. We built everything we had inside those walls, slowly, carefully, one paycheck at a time. Before I go on, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, especially on stories like this. After my husband passed, I stayed, not because I didn't have other options, but because the house still felt like something steady, something that remembered who I was even when everything else changed. When Daniel moved back in a few years ago, it felt temporary. He said it was just until things settled, work expenses, life. I didn't ask too many questions. I told myself that's what families did. You made space. You adjusted. At first it was small things. He would leave dishes in the sink a little longer than he used to. He stopped asking before inviting people over. The tone in his voice shifted in ways that were easy to ignore if you didn't look too closely. And I didn't. Because it's easier to believe things will correct themselves than to admit they're becoming something else. But standing there that night with his words still hanging in the air, I realized none of it had been small. Not the tone, not the distance, not the way decisions were made without me. In a house that still had my name on every document that mattered. I didn't kneel. I didn't say anything at all. I simply stepped back from the table, careful not to move too quickly, as if sudden motion might turn the moment into something louder than it already was. My hands felt steady, even if everything else inside me had gone quiet in a way I couldn't fully explain. No one stopped me as I walked out of the kitchen. No one called my name. Behind me, the room remained exactly as I had left it, still tense, waiting for something I had already decided I wasn't going to give. I reached the hallway and paused, my fingers brushing lightly against the wall, as if I needed something solid to remind me where I was. For years I had thought keeping the peace meant holding everything together. That night I understood it might have meant something else entirely. And for the first time, I felt the weight of that difference settle in. I walked to my room without looking back. I didn't need to see their faces to know something had already changed, not just for them, but for me too. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry, not because I kept replaying his words over and over again, but because something in me had gone very still. For years, I had told myself that the small things didn't matter, that families went through phases, that people said things they didn't always mean. But lying there in the dark, I realized how many times I had quietly adjusted myself just to keep everything from shifting too much. And once I started thinking about it, I couldn't stop. It hadn't started with something as obvious as that night. It had been smaller, easier to excuse. The first time Daniel spoke over me at the dinner table, I told myself he was distracted. He had always been opinionated, even as a child. I smiled and let it pass. The first time he made a decision about the house without asking me, moving furniture, inviting people I hadn't met, I told myself it wasn't worth making an issue out of it. It was his home too, after all. At least that's what I had been telling myself. There were moments I had dismissed without even realizing I was doing it. A quiet shift in the way he addressed me, a tone that carried less patience than before. A certain casualness, as if my presence required less consideration than it used to. None of it had seemed important on its own, but now laid side by side in my memory, they didn't feel small anymore. They felt connected. I thought about the way he had stopped asking, not just about guests or meals or plans for the house, but about anything that required acknowledging me as part of the decision. At some point, I had gone from being included to being informed, and then slowly to being overlooked altogether. I remembered a Sunday afternoon a few months earlier. He had people over, colleagues, I think. I stayed mostly in the kitchen preparing food, making sure everything was ready. At one point, I stepped into the living room to ask if anyone needed anything else. Daniel didn't introduce me. He didn't look at me the way he used to either. There was no pause, no shift in attention, just a brief glance like I was part of the background. One of his guests smiled politely and said, "Thank you." Daniel simply kept talking. I went back to the kitchen without saying anything. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. But now, thinking back on it, I realized it wasn't the moment itself. It was how natural it had felt to him. I thought about the way he spoke to Monica, gentler, more careful, more aware, and then I thought about the way he spoke to me, shorter sentences, fewer explanations, less patience when I asked questions he didn't feel like answering. It wasn't something he would have noticed if you asked him directly, but I had noticed. I just hadn't wanted to name it, because naming something makes it real, and once it's real, you can't pretend it's temporary anymore. There had been other moments too, small things that at the time seemed too insignificant to hold on to. The way he would sigh under his breath if I asked him to fix something around the house. The way he would check his phone while I was speaking, not even pretending to listen. The way decisions were made in conversations I wasn't part of, about a house that still carried my name on every document that mattered. I had adjusted each time, shifted slightly, softened my tone, stepped back a little further. Not because I didn't see it, but because I thought that was how you kept a family from breaking. But families don't break all at once. They shift, quietly, gradually, until one day you look up and realize your place has already been moved without anyone telling you. Lying there in the dark, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to fully see before. That night at the dinner table wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even the worst moment. It was just the first time it had been said out loud, clearly enough that I couldn't explain it away. And once something is that clear, it doesn't leave you any room to pretend anymore. It wasn't just one moment. It never had been. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't something that had just happened. It was something that had been happening for a long time. The house was quiet by the time I turned on the light in my room. Not the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. The kind that settles after something has already broken. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, still in the same clothes, my hands resting in my lap, as if I had simply paused in the middle of something and forgotten how to continue. For years, when something felt off, I had always tried to fix it. A softer tone, a different choice of words, a little more patience. I had believed that if I adjusted enough, things would find their way back to where they were supposed to be. But that night, sitting there in the dim light, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to fully admit before. There was nothing left to adjust. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a reality that had already settled into place. My eyes moved slowly around the room. The dresser, the small framed photo of my husband, the chair by the window I used to sit in during the afternoons. Everything looked the same, and yet none of it felt quite as steady as it used to. After a while, I stood up and walked over to the desk. It was an old habit when I needed to think I sat there. It was where I used to sort through bills, write notes, keep track of things that needed attention, things that kept a household running quietly in the background. I opened the top drawer without thinking. Inside were envelopes, receipts, a few folded documents. Nothing unusual. Just the small, ordinary evidence of a life that had been managed carefully for a very long time. My fingers paused over a stack of cash I had taken out earlier that week. It wasn't a large amount, just something I kept on hand for groceries, for small things that didn't require much thought. For a moment I simply looked at it, then I picked it up. The bills felt light in my hand, almost insignificant, and yet I knew exactly where every dollar had come from. Years of working, years of saving, making sure the mortgage was paid, the utilities never missed, the house running without anyone thinking about how. I had never thought of it as anything more than responsibility, something you did when you were part of a family, something you did because it needed to be done. But standing there holding that money, I realized something that felt strangely unfamiliar. None of it had ever been invisible. I had simply treated it that way. I had made it easy for everything to continue without requiring acknowledgement, and over time that had turned into something else. Not appreciation, expectation. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, the bills still in my hand. For a second I thought about putting them back, about closing the drawer and leaving everything exactly where it was, the way I always had. But the thought didn't stay. Because the structure had already changed, not loudly. Not dramatically, just enough that I couldn't return to the same place I had been standing before. I looked down at the money again, and this time I didn't see something practical. I saw something that had been given quietly, repeatedly, without ever being named for what it was. Support, stability, presence, things that had been there long before anyone thought to question whether they could be taken for granted. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else. There was no anger left in the movement, no urgency, no need to prove anything, just a quiet clarity. I took one bill and folded it in half. The sound was soft, barely noticeable. Then I tore it, cleanly, slowly. The paper gave way without resistance. It was the first thing that had in a long time. I placed the pieces on the desk. Then I took another, folded it the same way, tore it just as carefully. There was something almost deliberate in the rhythm of it, not reckless, not emotional, measured, controlled. Each tear felt less like destruction and more like separation, like drawing a line that had never been clearly marked before. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I simply continued until the small stack was no longer what it had been when I first picked it up. When I was done, I sat back in the chair and looked at what remained. Pieces. Nothing more, and yet I didn't feel like I had lost anything. If anything, I felt clearer. The room was still quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt settled. I rested my hands on the desk, letting the stillness sit without trying to fill it. For the first time that night, my breathing felt even, steady, unforced. I wasn't trying to fix anything anymore. I wasn't trying to hold something together that had already shifted out of place. I was simply seeing it as it was. And once you see something that clearly there isn't much left to argue with. I gathered the torn pieces into a small pile and left them where they were. I didn't need to clean it up. I didn't need to explain it. It had already done what it needed to do. I stood up slowly and turned off the light. As the room fell back into darkness, I realized something had changed, not around me but within me. Not in a way that needed to be announced. Not in a way anyone else would notice right away. I wasn't going to respond the same way again. Not this time. And not again. The next morning, the house felt the same. Sunlight came through the kitchen windows the way it always did, settling across the counter, catching the edges of the cabinets, making everything look calm and familiar. Nothing looked different, but the balance had already changed. I moved through the space, slowly, not out of hesitation, but because there was no urgency left in me. No need to get ahead of anything, to anticipate, to prepare. For years, my mornings had followed the same pattern. Coffee first, then breakfast, making sure everything was ready before anyone else came into the room. I had always thought of it as routine. Something simple, something expected. That morning, I made my coffee, and nothing else. I didn't take out the extra plates. I didn't check what was in the refrigerator. I didn't ask what anyone might want. I simply sat down at the table, wrapped my hands around the mug, and let the quiet settle the way it had the night before. It wasn't a decision I had planned. It just felt unnecessary to do anything more. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Daniel walked into the kitchen, his expression still carrying the weight of sleep. He glanced toward the counter, then at the stove, then back at me. There was a pause. A small one, the kind most people wouldn't notice. "You're up early," he said. I nodded slightly, lifting the mug just enough to acknowledge him. He waited just for a second longer than usual. Then he walked past me, opening cabinets, looking inside as if something might be there that he simply hadn't seen yet. There was no irritation in the movement. Not yet. Just expectation. He closed one cabinet, opened another, then the refrigerator. Still nothing. I didn't say anything. The silence stretched a little further this time. "Did you already eat?" he asked, not turning around. "No," I said. Another pause. I could hear the shift in it now, not confusion exactly, but the beginning of it. He turned slightly, looking at the table, then at the counter again. "Are you making something?" he asked. The question was casual, but there was something underneath it, a habit searching for its usual answer. I shook my head. No, that was all. No explanation, no apology, no adjustment to soften it. Just the answer. He stood there for a moment as if waiting for something else to follow. When nothing did, he reached for a glass, filled it with water, and leaned back against the counter. The kitchen felt different now. Not louder, not tense, just unfamiliar. I took another sip of my coffee. Slowly. The way I used to when I was alone in the house before everything became something that needed to be shared, prepared, or managed. Daniel watched me for a second. Not directly. More like he was trying to place something that didn't quite fit. "You okay?" he asked. The question came out lighter than it felt. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. That was the part that felt the most unfamiliar. There was no tightness in my chest, no pressure to smooth the moment over, no instinct to explain myself in a way that would make things easier for him. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I wasn't trying to restore what had already shifted. I simply existed in the space, without adjusting. He nodded, but it didn't look like agreement. More like acknowledgement without understanding. A few minutes passed. He moved around the kitchen again, slower this time, less certain, opening and closing things without the same automatic rhythm as before. At one point, his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward my room, then back to me. "You didn't, He started, then stopped. I didn't help him finish the sentence. I didn't ask what he meant. If there was something he wanted to say, he could say it. That had always been the arrangement, even if I had been the only one following it. He let it go. Or at least, he let that version of it go. A few minutes later, I heard movement down the hallway, drawers opening, then closing. A little faster now. The sound carried differently in the morning quiet, not loud, but sharp enough to notice. I kept my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my palms. I didn't turn. I didn't listen for more than what naturally reached me. Whatever he was looking for, he would find. Or he wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't something I needed to step into. The footsteps came back quicker this time. More direct. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen. "Did you go through my things?" he asked. There it was. Not anger. Not yet, but something closer to it. I looked up at him. "No," I said. The answer was simple, because it was true. His jaw tightened slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough that I noticed. He hesitated, like he was deciding whether to push further or let it rest where it was. In the past, I would have filled that space, explained, clarified, offered something to make the moment easier to move past. That instinct didn't come this time. I held his gaze for a second longer than I normally would have. Then I looked back down at my coffee. The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because there was nothing else being offered to continue it. He stayed where he was for another moment, then turned away, walking back toward the hallway. Slower now, more deliberate, as if he was trying to understand something that hadn't quite revealed itself yet. I finished my coffee and set the mug down gently on the table. The quiet settled differently this time, but not in the same way as before. This time, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt like something that had already been decided, and for the first time I could feel it clearly. The balance had already changed, not for me, and now, not for him either. I left the house later that morning without saying where I was going. No one asked. Daniel was in the living room, his attention split between his phone and something on the television. He glanced up when I passed by like he was about to say something, then didn't. That too felt different. I took my coat, my bag, and my keys, nothing more, nothing less, and stepped outside into the quiet of the street. The air was cool, steady. It felt clearer than it had the night before. For a long time, when something unsettled me, I would wait. Give it time. Let it settle on its own. Hope it would resolve without needing to be named. That instinct didn't follow me out the door. The drive to the bank was familiar. I had taken that route more times than I could count, usually with a list in my head, things to deposit, things to check, things to make sure we're still in order. That morning, there was no list. Just one thing: clarity. When I walked inside, the space felt exactly the way it always had. Quiet conversations, soft footsteps, the low, steady rhythm of people handling things that mattered, but never loudly. I stepped up to the counter and gave my name. The young man behind the desk smiled, politely asked a few routine questions, then directed me to one of the offices along the side. I sat down across from a woman who introduced herself as Karen. Her voice was calm, professional, familiar in a way that didn't require explanation. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I folded my hands in my lap, taking a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to say it clearly. "I'd like to review all accounts under my name," I said. She nodded, turning slightly toward her computer. Of course. There was nothing unusual in the request, at least not on the surface. She asked for identification. I provided it. She typed, clicked, scrolled. The small sounds of the keyboard filled the space between us. After a moment, she began listing the accounts: checking, savings, a line of credit, a few smaller holdings I had set aside over the years. Each one appeared exactly as I remembered, organized, accounted for. "What would you like to do with them?" she asked. I looked at the screen, then back at her. "I want to confirm access," I said. "Who's authorized?" She nodded again, her expression unchanged. A few more clicks. "Currently," she said, "you are the primary holder on all accounts. There is one secondary access authorization on the checking account. I didn't need to ask who that was." "Can you remove that?" I asked. There was no hesitation in my voice, no explanation, just the question. Karen glanced at me briefly, then back at the screen. "Yes," she said. "We can do that." She turned the monitor slightly, indicating where I needed to sign. The form was simple. A few lines, a few spaces for initials. I read it carefully anyway. Not because I expected anything unexpected, but because this time I wasn't going to let anything pass without being seen clearly. When I signed my name, my hand didn't shake. It moved the way it always had, steady, practiced. Final. Karen processed the change, typing quietly for a moment longer. "That access has been removed," she said. I nodded. There was no immediate feeling attached to it. No sense of relief, no sense of loss. Just alignment. As if something that had been slightly off for a long time had been set back into place. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" she asked. I considered the question for a moment. In the past, I might have said no, might have assumed that what I had done was enough, that the rest could remain as it was. But that assumption didn't hold the same weight anymore. "I'd like to review any linked permissions," I said. "Online access, notifications, anything that allows visibility." Karen nodded again, this time with a hint of recognition. "Of course." We went through each setting one by one: login credentials, authorized devices, email notifications, small things on their own, but together they formed a kind of access I had never thought much about before. I adjusted what needed adjusting, removed what needed removing, confirmed what I chose to keep. There was no urgency in it, no rush to finish, just a quiet, methodical process of making sure that everything reflected what I now understood to be true. When we were done, Karen printed a summary and slid it across the desk. "All set," she said. I glanced over it, then folded it neatly and placed it in my bag. "Thank you," I said. She smiled. "You're welcome." I stood smoothing my coat slightly before stepping back into the main area of the bank. Nothing around me had changed. People were still moving through their own routines, handling their own responsibilities. But as I walked toward the door, I noticed something I hadn't felt before. Not uncertainty, not hesitation. Control. Not in a way that needed to be shown. Not in a way that required anyone else to acknowledge it, but in a way that was unmistakably mine. I stepped outside the door, closing softly behind me. For a moment, I stood there, letting the air settle around me again. The street looked the same as it had when I arrived, but I didn't. I reached into my bag, feeling the edge of the folded paper beneath my fingers, not as proof, not as something I needed to hold on to, just as a quiet confirmation. Things were no longer where they had been, and they weren't going back. When I got home, the house was no longer quiet in the same way. The television was still on, but the volume had been lowered. The air felt tighter, as if something had been waiting. Daniel was standing in the kitchen. He wasn't moving. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the expression on his face, not the way his shoulders were set, just the stillness. He turned when he heard the door close. "Where were you?" he asked. The question came out too quickly, like it had been sitting there for a while. I set my bag down on the table, taking off my coat before answering. "Out," I said. That was all. No explanation, no detail, just the answer. He stared at me for a moment, as if waiting for something else to follow. When nothing did, his expression shifted slightly. Not yet anger, but something closer to it. "I went to check something this morning," he said. "My account." I nodded once. "I know," I said. That was enough to confirm it. The shift in his posture was immediate. "What do you mean, you know?" he asked. His voice was still controlled, but just barely. I walked past him, setting my keys down next to my bag, moving with the same steady pace I had held on to since the night before. "You removed my access," he said. This time it wasn't a question. I didn't turn around right away. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the sound fill the space between us before I answered. "Yes." The word landed quietly, but it didn't leave much room for interpretation. He let out a short breath, something between disbelief and irritation. "Why would you do that?" he asked. I took a sip of water before setting the glass down. "I needed to," I said. Again, no explanation, no justification, just the statement. "That doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice tightening now. "It's been like that for years." I nodded slightly. "I know." That seemed to make it worse. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the kitchen before turning back toward me. "Is this about last night?" he asked. "Because if it is, you're blowing it way out of proportion." There it was. The first shift. From confusion to control. I let the silence answer. "I didn't mean it like that," he continued quickly. "You know how things get sometimes. People say things. It doesn't mean anything." I picked up my glass again, taking another slow sip. The silence stretched. He waited. I could feel it. The expectation that I would step in, soften, it'd make it easier for both of us to move past. That had always been my role. Not this time. "Are you seriously not going to say anything?" he asked. His voice was sharper now. I set the glass down carefully. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it didn't waver. He stared at me. For a second it looked like he didn't quite know where to go from there. That didn't last long. "Fine," he said, his tone shifting again. "If that's how you want to handle it, then we need to talk about how things are going to work around here." There was a different edge to it now. Less defensive, more deliberate. "I've been helping out," he continued. "Paying for things. Being here. You can't just start making decisions like that without talking to me." I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I just listened. Not because I was considering what he was saying, but because I no longer felt the need to respond to it. "That's not how this works," he added. I met his eyes then. Calmly, without challenge, without agreement. Just present. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away first. Another small shift. He exhaled slower this time. "Look," he said, his voice lowering again, softening slightly. "If something's bothering you, we can figure it out. You don't have to do things like this." There it was. The next move. Not control, not yet. Something closer to reassurance. Or what sounded like it. I said nothing. The silence felt different now. Not empty, not passive, but deliberate. He waited again. Longer this time. When nothing came, the frustration returned. "Okay," he said sharper now. "You can't just cut me off like that. I live here too." The words landed harder, more direct. A hint of something else underneath them. Something closer to a warning. I didn't react. I didn't move. I didn't shift to accommodate it. I simply stood there exactly as I had been. That seemed to be the moment something in him finally faltered. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. His expression changed, not into anger, not fully, but into something uncertain, like he was trying to understand a version of the situation that no longer followed the pattern he was used to. For the first time since I had walked into the house, he didn't have something ready to say. He just looked at me. And I could see it clearly. He was waiting for the version of me that would explain this, that would soften it, that would make it make sense in a way that allowed everything to go back to how it had been. That version didn't exist anymore. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I picked up my bag and moved past him, heading toward the hallway. I didn't need to say anything else. Behind me, the kitchen remained still. But this time the silence didn't belong to me. It belonged to him. And for the first time, I could feel it settling in. The control he relied on wasn't there anymore. And he knew it. I didn't say anything else to him that day. There wasn't anything left to say that would have changed what had already been made clear. The house moved around me the way it always had, quiet footsteps, doors opening and closing, the low hum of routines that had once felt shared. But I wasn't part of it in the same way anymore. And I didn't try to be. That afternoon, I went into my room and sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, looking around at the things I had kept without ever really thinking about why. The dresser, the photographs, the small pieces of a life that had been built slowly over years that no longer needed to be explained to anyone. I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel uncertain. But I did feel something else. Distance. Not from the house, from the version of myself that had stayed in it for as long as I had. I stood up and opened the closet. There were things I didn't need anymore, things I had kept out of habit, not necessity. I pulled out a small suitcase and set it on the bed, not because I was leaving that moment, but because I understood something had already ended. And when something ends quietly, it doesn't always announce itself. It just stops being what it was. I packed slowly. A few clothes, documents, the things that mattered in ways that didn't need to be seen by anyone else. There was no emotion attached to it, no hesitation, just movement. At one point, I paused, my hand resting on the edge of the suitcase, and thought about someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Olivia. The last time I had seen her, she had been sitting at the table, her eyes lowered, her voice quiet. She had always been that way around Daniel. Careful, measured, as if she was constantly adjusting herself to avoid saying the wrong thing. At the time, I had thought it was just her nature. Now I wasn't so sure. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Her name was still there. I hadn't removed it. I just hadn't used it. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I didn't want to call, but because I didn't know what I would hear on the other end. Then I pressed it anyway. The line rang longer than I expected. Once, twice, 3 times. I almost ended the call. Then she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was quieter than I remembered. "Olivia, it's me," I said. There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough. "Hi," she said finally. Something in the way she said it felt careful, like she was measuring the space between us before stepping into it. "I just wanted to check on you," I said. It was the simplest thing I could say. The truest. "I'm okay," she replied quickly, too quickly. I let the silence sit between us, just long enough for it to settle. "You don't have to answer like that," I said gently. Another pause, this one longer. "I didn't think you'd call," she admitted. Her voice had shifted slightly, less guarded. "Why not?" I asked. She hesitated again. "I just thought you were upset," she said. "With me." The words didn't land the way they might have before, not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't fit. "With you," I repeated. "Yes," she said, quieter now. "After everything." I felt something settle into place, not sharply, not suddenly, but clearly. "What do you mean?" I asked. There was a small sound on the other end of the line, like she was adjusting her grip on the phone. "I know what happened," she said. "At dinner." I waited. "He told me you were angry," she continued, "that you felt disrespected and that you didn't want me around anymore because of it." The space held stillness again, but not in the same way as before. This wasn't confusion. This was recognition. I never said that I replied. The words came out calm, certain. There was silence on the other end, a different kind this time. Not guarded, not cautious, just processing. "He said you didn't want me coming over anymore," she added quietly, "that it would be better if I gave you some space." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not out of frustration, not out of anger, but because something had just become undeniable. "I didn't ask for space," I said. My voice didn't change. It didn't need to. Another pause. Longer now. I thought I did something wrong," she admitted. Her voice was smaller than it had been at the beginning of the call, like something in her had been holding that belief for longer than she realized. "You didn't," I said. There was no hesitation in it. No room for doubt. "I would have told you if something was wrong," I added. That seemed to land differently. I could hear it. The shift. Subtle, but real. "I didn't know what to think," she said. "He made it sound like you were upset with everyone." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was placing something carefully into its proper place. This wasn't just about that night. It wasn't just about the way he had spoken to me. It was about everything that had happened around it, what had been said, what hadn't, what had been changed in between, and who had been kept from seeing the full picture. If you were listening to this and wondering what you would have done in that moment, would you have confronted him or stayed quiet and waited until you knew the truth? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. "I'm not upset with you," I said finally. The words were simple, but they carried something different now, something clearer. Then why did he say that, she asked? I didn't answer right away, because I already knew, not in a way that needed to be proven, but in a way that had been building piece by piece over time. The same pattern, the same quiet adjustments, just applied somewhere else. "He's been handling things his own way," I said. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was enough. There was a soft exhale on the other end of the line. I didn't like how it felt, she said, but I didn't want to make it worse. "I understand," I replied. And I did, because I had done the same thing for years. Adjusted, stayed quiet, tried not to disrupt what already felt unsteady. "I'm glad you called," she added, almost as if she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I let that sit between us for a moment. "I am too," I said. We didn't talk much longer after that. We didn't need to. Some conversations don't require more than a few truths to change everything. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, the phone still in my hand. The room hadn't changed. The house hadn't changed. But the picture had. What I had seen before as distance was something else entirely. Control, not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. And it hadn't been limited to me. It had extended further than I had allowed myself to see. I set the phone down beside me and looked at the open suitcase on the bed. For a long time I had believed that what was happening inside that house was something contained, something that could be managed quietly without affecting anything beyond it. That wasn't true. It had already reached beyond me, and now that I could see it clearly, there wasn't anything left to question. Not about what had happened, and not about what I was going to do next. That evening the house didn't feel like it was waiting anymore. It felt like it was holding something in place. I had finished packing what I needed. The suitcase sat closed at the foot of the bed, not as a signal of urgency, but as a quiet confirmation that I had already made my decision. I didn't rush. There was no reason to. Down the hall I could hear movement, drawers opening, closing, footsteps that carried a different kind of weight than before, not casual, not distracted, focused. After a while, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. "What is this?" he asked. His eyes moved past me, landing on the suitcase. The question wasn't really a question. It was a demand for an explanation. I stood where I was, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the dresser. "Just packing," I said. My voice stayed even, unmoved, for what he pressed. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have one, but because the answer didn't need to be given the way he expected. He stepped further into the room. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The words came out sharper than before, more certain, as if saying them that way might make them true. I met his eyes. "I am," I said. That was all. No added explanation, no softening, just the truth. Something in his expression shifted. The certainty didn't disappear, but it cracked. "You can't just leave like this," he said. "This is your house." I didn't step in this time, not to the statement, not to the implication behind it. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair again, pacing once across the room before turning back toward me. "This doesn't make any sense," he continued. "First the account, now this. You're acting like something's wrong." I let the silence answer for me, because something was wrong, and it had been for a long time. "You're overreacting," he added quickly. "Whatever you think happened, it's not what you think." There it was again. The same pattern, reframing, redirecting, trying to take control of the meaning before it settled into something he couldn't manage. I didn't engage. That seemed to push him further. "Look," he said, his tone shifting again, lower now, more deliberate. "If this is about the house, we can figure that out. We can make changes. I can start contributing more. We don't have to do this like this." I watched him as he spoke, not the words, the structure of them. Offer, adjustment, control disguised as compromise. "I've been helping out," he continued. "I've been here. I've been part of this. You can't just cut me out." I let the words pass. They didn't land the way they used to, because they weren't new. They were just being said differently. "I'm not cutting you out," I said. My voice stayed calm, steady. "I'm making a change." That was the first time I had said it out loud, not to him, but into the space between us. He stopped moving. The room felt still again. "A change," he repeated. Yes, the word didn't carry anything extra. It didn't need to. He looked at me, searching for something and opening a contradiction, a place to step back in and take hold of the conversation again. There wasn't one. "You don't just get to decide that," he said. The tone had shifted again, less controlled, more forceful. "I live here too. I stayed exactly where I was, because that wasn't the question anymore. It never had been." He took another step forward. "So what, you're just gonna walk out?" he said, "and leave everything like this?" I glanced at the suitcase, then back at him. Yes, there was no hesitation in it. None. The word settled differently this time, not like an answer, like a line, something final, something that didn't move. He stared at me, and for a second I saw it. The moment where everything he had been trying, every shift in tone, every change in approach, failed to find its place. There was nowhere left for him to go. No version of the conversation that returned things to what they had been. No way to reframe it. No way to redirect it. No way to control it. "You can't do this," he said again. But the words didn't carry the same weight anymore. They sounded uncertain, like they belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. I didn't argue. I gave him nothing to work with. I didn't explain. I simply stood there, unmoved. He looked around the room as if something in it might give him an answer he wasn't getting from me. The dresser, the suitcase, the quiet space that no longer responded to him the way it once had. And then slowly, his expression changed. Not into anger, not fully, but into something else, something closer to realization. He wasn't leading this anymore. He wasn't shaping it. He wasn't ahead of it. He was reacting, and for the first time it showed. the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something less defined. He looked back at me. Really looked this time, as if trying to understand how the same person could be standing in front of him, and yet not be the same at all. I held his gaze, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, just to let him see what was already there. Nothing was going to shift back. Nothing was going to be adjusted to make this easier. Not this time. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't waiting anymore. It had already settled, and in that stillness it became clear he had lost it. Not just the argument, not just the moment, something deeper, the control he had relied on all along, and he knew it. The next morning came quietly. There was no sense of urgency, no sudden movement to match the weight of what had already been decided. The rooms held their silence, not tense, not waiting, just still. I woke before the light had fully settled through the windows, the room holding that soft in-between shade that comes just before morning becomes something defined. For a moment I lay there listening, not for anything specific. Just the quiet. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the floor before standing. The suitcase was still where I had left it, closed and ready. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't a reaction. It was simply the next step. I dressed without thinking too much about it. Simple clothes. Comfortable. The kind of things I had worn for years without ever questioning why. Some habits didn't need to be changed, only the ones that had been holding something in place. When I stepped into the hallway, the house greeted me the same way it always had. Quiet walls, familiar light, the small ordinary details that had once made everything feel settled. I moved through it slowly, not to hold on to anything, just to pass through it one last time as it was. The kitchen was empty. The chair I had sat in the day before was still slightly pulled out from the table. The glass I had used sat clean in the rack exactly where I had placed it. Everything was in order. Everything looked the same. I rested my hand briefly on the back of the chair. Not out of attachment, just acknowledgement. For years, this space had been where I adjusted myself, where I softened things before they became something else, where I kept everything running quietly in the background. I let my hand fall back to my side. There was nothing left to adjust. I walked to the front door, the suitcase rolling softly behind me. The sound was steady, even. It didn't echo the way I thought it might. It simply followed. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to recognize the moment for what it was. Not an ending, not entirely, but a shift. Something that had been building for a long time now settling into something final. Behind me, the house remained quiet. There were no footsteps, no voices, no movement that suggested anyone was about to stop me. I didn't expect there to be. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. I opened the door. The morning air met me immediately, cool, steady, carrying the faint sound of the street beyond the driveway. It felt different from the air inside, lighter, not because it had changed, but because I had. I stepped outside the suitcase, rolling over the threshold behind me. For a brief moment, I stood there, the door still open at my back. The house behind me held everything it always had, years of memory, routine, silence that I had once filled without realizing it. I didn't turn to look at it, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. Everything I needed to understand about that space, I already did. I reached back and closed the door gently. The sound was soft, final, but not heavy. Just complete. I adjusted my grip on the handle of the suitcase and stepped forward onto the path leading away from the house. Each step felt the same, even, unforced. There was no hesitation in it, no pull to stop, to reconsider, to check if something had been left behind, because nothing had been left unfinished. The questions had already been answered. The patterns had already been seen. The decisions had already been made. The street stretched out ahead, familiar in a way that didn't carry the same weight as before. Just a place to move through. Just space. I kept walking. The house behind me grew smaller with each step, though I didn't measure it that way. I didn't track the distance. I didn't listen for anything calling me back, because there wasn't anything left that needed me to return. Not in the way it had before. The air felt steady. The light clearer now, the morning fully settled into itself. I adjusted the pace slightly, not faster, not slower, just enough to match the rhythm that felt natural. There was no rush to reach anywhere, no need to prove anything, just movement, forward. I didn't look back. The first few days felt unfamiliar, not in a way that made me question anything, just different. The apartment was smaller than the house I had left behind. A single bedroom, a modest kitchen, a window that looked out onto a quiet street lined with trees that were just beginning to change. There wasn't much to fill the space, and that was the point. I set my suitcase down near the bed and took my time unpacking. There was no urgency in it, no need to put everything in its place right away. For years I'd lived inside routines that required me to stay ahead of everything, anticipating needs adjusting before something became a problem. Here there was nothing waiting, nothing to manage, nothing to fix. The silence felt different from the one I had left behind. It wasn't something I had to carry. It simply existed. I made coffee that first morning the same way I always had, slowly, without thinking. But this time when I sat down with the cup in my hands, there was no sense that I was preparing for something else to begin. There was nothing after it, just the moment itself. I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in a long time. The way the light moved across the floor in the afternoon. The sound of footsteps passing outside disconnected from me in a way that felt freeing. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in a space that didn't expect anything from me. Days passed without interruption. No raised voices, no questions waiting for answers I didn't want to give, no need to explain where I had been or why I had done something a certain way. I wasn't avoiding anything. I simply wasn't part of it anymore. And that absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. I spoke to Olivia again a few times. The conversations were simple, uncomplicated. She didn't sound as careful as she had before. There was less hesitation in her voice, less need to measure every word. I didn't ask her to explain that. I didn't need to. Some changes speak for themselves. I didn't hear from Daniel, not in those first days. There were no messages, no calls. At one point I noticed that and paused just for a second. Not out of concern, not out of expectation, just acknowledgement. Then I continued with what I was doing. There wasn't anything to respond to, and for the first time that felt complete. I settled into a rhythm that didn't require adjustment. Morning coffee, a walk in the afternoon, quiet evenings that didn't feel like something waiting to be interrupted. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt perfect, no dramatic shift that marked the difference. It was quieter than that, more subtle, the absence of tension, the absence of expectation, the absence of something I had carried for so long I hadn't realized how much space it took up. One evening I sat by the window watching the light fade slowly into the street. There was nothing remarkable about it. No event, no realization that needed to be named, just the steady feeling of being exactly where I was without needing to change it. For a long time I had believed that holding a family together meant staying, adjusting, making room even when there wasn't any left, but sometimes what you hold on to quietly is the very thing that keeps everything from becoming what it needs to be. And sometimes letting go isn't loud. It doesn't ask for recognition. It doesn't need to be understood by anyone else. It just happens. I took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle the way it always did now. It wasn't heavy anymore. It simply existed. If you had been in my place, would you have stayed and tried to fix things, or walked away when you realized nothing was going to change? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. If this story stayed with you, I'd really like to hear what you think. And if you feel like it, you can share it with someone who might understand.